All right, good morning. I'm so excited to see so many faces in the audience that I know and love, and I'm so excited to meet folks I haven't met today and tonight at Posters and tomorrow. And I have the privilege of spending roughly the next hour with you. And so hopefully this title is queuing up a song in your mind. I do not sing, so I will not help you with that cue. But I learned that yesterday would have been John Lennon's 84th birthday. So it felt very well timed for this talk. And this talk is going to be guided by some resources, so I just want to reassure you that while you don't yet have my slides, you do have a handout with hyperlinks to all the resources, so you can sit back and relax and know they're there. And this talk was inspired by a conversation I had with a colleague. And he had the opportunity to redesign a teacher preparation program and an administrator preparation program. So he was offered the chance to change what pre-service training looked like in an institution in the Southeast. And he's a special educator like I am. And so he came from this perspective of, well, what if we redesigned pre-service education to center students that have the greatest needs, students that we serve? Because we're kind of biased, but we think that if everybody delivered really high quality evidence-based practice, all kids would benefit, not just students who need us to be at our best. And so as we had that conversation, I stepped back and thought, why are we just having this conversation about pre-service? This is the conversation we should be having about all of education. And so it brought one of my students to mind. So I want to introduce you to D'Angelo, and I'm going to give you a spoiler alert that this is a really happy story. But it's going to start in a place that's slightly less happy. I was messaging with his mom last night to make sure she was okay with me sharing his story with you. And I worked with him over 20 years ago. So he is no longer with us today, but he landed his life in a really happy, good place. The reason he comes to mind, though, is my former life, before I came to UConn in 2005, was as the director of a school that served kids with really intensive social, emotional, behavioral, and academic needs. So we had the students come to us who were not able or had not been sufficiently educated in their home schools, their home districts, and often their countywide placements. And when I first read about D'Angelo, when we knew that he was coming to our school, I read his diagnosis, which is Cornelia de Lange, a syndrome I hadn't heard about until we met him. And I read about his supports, which included that he was in a hug. So pause for a moment and picture what you think that is. So on the day he arrived at our school and came off the bus, he was in a wheelchair, and his hug was a straitjacket. So his arms were strapped to where he had no movement, and he was in a wheelchair that prevented him from moving his legs. And so it gave me, for obvious reasons, huge pause to ask how we got here. How did this child, and when I met him he was about 13, arrive at our school in this kind of a situation? Where had we as educators, not from bad intention, not from desire to do harm, but where had we as educators failed him to where this is how he showed up in his new environment? And I told you his story ends in a happy place. But I'm going to save the end of his story for the end of the talk. So I want you to think about your student. Need comes in all shapes and sizes. You may never meet a student as awesome as D'Angelo. He is one of my favorite humans. But you have students who are being asked to check their identity at the door. You have students that we have marginalized intentionally or unintentionally, students that we have excluded. You have students with a range of needs. Some we are meeting successfully and some we are not. So I want you to put your student in your head or your heart, which is where I call it Carrie D. And I want you to think about, imagine if we designed our outcomes, our data, systems, and practices in ways that truly student-centered equity that made it so each and every student, family, and educator had their voices, their experiences, their goals, their beliefs, their dreams centered in the work that we do. Imagine if we truly did that. Imagine if we created classrooms that set every kid up for success, schools that set every educator and classroom up for success, districts that proactively supported schools and set them up for success, and states that had supportive systems for districts in need to set them up for success too. So imagine if we truly did that. Now, some of y'all are sitting here thinking, does she know where we are? Because haven't we already done that? Like, isn't that the whole point of PBIS? And the really cool thing is in pre-service, we sometimes get students now who have come through education in PBIS schools. So for some of them, they truly think this is how we have always done education. But I wanted to remind us a little bit how new this work is for us. So the conversations about prevention, the conversations about universal support for a population really came into focus in the 1960s. They're relatively new in the timeline of our field. And we didn't really start having those conversations about our schools until the 80s and 90s. And it was in the 90s that they first started to be funded and come into a conversation in the research literature. And we started to see framework labels like positive behavioral interventions and supports, response to intervention or instruction, because some people call it each, and multi-tiered systems of support. We started to see those actually be written about and talked about and come into the public conversation. For many of us, that was well after we were already in the work we're doing. And I want to just highlight, we have a lot to be proud of in that time. So our center was initially funded in 1998, and we have consistently been growing and increasing the number of schools we serve. You notice a little dip in the pandemic years. But even during the pandemic, we have always hit over 25,000 schools since about 2017. So we are reaching many schools, which makes us so excited because we are then reaching many students. And we show this graph every year because we get excited about the growth, and we will update this graph in the coming month. We just didn't have it updated in time for today. And while we get excited about the growth, we get even more excited about the number of schools that are measuring fidelity. In other words, they're not just saying they're doing it, they're working towards doing it better. And of those schools that are measuring, even during the pandemic, 2/3 of them were realizing implementation with fidelity at Tier 1. So we truly have a large number of schools that care deeply about doing this work and are doing it well. And you probably noticed that the bars got smaller. I kept the axis the same just so we could be aware that we have room to grow. And luckily, we have a new TFI 3.0 that will help us grow even further in enhancing what it means to implement with fidelity. So this work is new, and how many of you are in states that are currently saying you're integrating multi-tiered systems of support? You're doing it for academics and behavior. I can't count that fast, but that's a lot. That's an even newer piece. We're starting to see many folks talk about integrating academics and social emotional behavioral support within an integrated MTSS framework. I have a couple of resources that are just small briefs that are up on mtss.org, which is one of our partner sites. So I think we have a lot to celebrate, but with any new work, we still have work to do. So we have students that are not fully experiencing all that PBIS or MTSS has to offer. Our students who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, and students who identify with disabilities are less likely to have access to evidence-based, especially positive and proactive practice. Think about that. And they are more likely to be excluded through exclusionary discipline. When we look at students' climate ratings and we disaggregate the data, we have students that are telling us that school climate is not the same for us. Our Black, Brown, and Indigenous students and students who identify in the LGBTQI community are telling us that school is not the most positive place for them. We have students who are in those same groups experiencing elevated levels of mental health need and less access to mental health supports. So the message is not that we shouldn't be celebrating where we are. The message is we shouldn't be happy staying where we are. We still have work to do. And the positive news is we have a lot of research that shows us PBIS can be the path through this work. So thanks to some of the work of the center, we have a great resource that documents when we do PBIS well, when we implement with fidelity, we turn the dial on outcomes that are important for kids. We turn the dial on our reliance on exclusionary discipline, and we make schools better for educators. So we can set everyone up for success. And when we do that in a way that intentionally centers racial equity, we can start to see discipline gaps close. And with effective Tier 1, universal Tier 1 support, we can enhance the supports available for students with disabilities. So again, a lot to celebrate, and we still have work to do. So I'm going to invite us to imagine better. And Ruthie was amazing at helping me kind of walk through some of this content. And we were chatting about if we get complacent, if we accept that where we are now is as good as we're going to be, we are buying into a stock story. And when you join Dr. Pano-Simmons tomorrow morning for her keynote, you will learn what that means if you don't already know, and you'll hear about how we can use stories to move the dial for social justice. So we are so thrilled that you are here with us and excited to imagine better. And I know Brian asked a couple of these questions, but folks have come in. So I want you to think hard about the work you're doing in your building, in your district, in your state. How many of you are in the getting ready phase for some part of your framework? So maybe you're doing Tier 1 well, but you're here to learn about Tier 2 or Tier 3. You can raise your hand multiple times. How many of you are in the getting ready phase for some part of your framework? Awesome, some of you. How many of you are in the active planning? You're kind of past exploration, you know this is what you want to do, you've invested, and you're ready to almost get started actually doing the work with your kids for one or more parts of your framework? Some. How many of y'all are doing this, and you've been doing it, and you're in that continuous improvement cycle where you're going to continue to get better and better? Awesome. If I was raising my hand, I probably would have raised my hand in all three. Because I feel like there are always parts of the framework, if we're doing this work well, where we're in each and every phase. But just be aware, the strands are organized to support you wherever. Fully in the getting ready strand phase, there is a getting ready strand. All right, I'm going to break our graphic for a second, and I'm going to ask you to think about yourself. So we did this early, but I want to hear from everyone in the room. For how many of you is this your very first time joining us for the forum? It's amazing. That's got to be at least 80%. Amazing. How many of you have been here for, let's say, 2 to 5? So exciting. I don't know exactly percent, but let's say 15, because the triangle makes sense in my head. How many of you have been here for more than 5 years? Maybe some of you as many as 20 or 20 plus. Amazing. That has to be more than 5%, but again, triangle math works in my head. So what I wanted us to think about is how we are going to focus your first step. If you're fully in the getting ready phase, maybe your school is doing a lot, but you're here as an initial learner. Or if you're in that continuous improvement phase or anything in between. And for me, it comes back to where we started. It comes back to the one. So I want you to think about, when you have your student in mind, what are the things you would do to set that student up for success? And you don't have to share out loud, but just think about the things you would do. And my guess is, as you're thinking about positive and proactive strategies to greet them, to welcome them into a space, to connect with them, to arrange an environment that's welcoming and supportive of them. Probably some of you are also thinking about ways you would explicitly teach and support them and engage them in meaningful instruction. And probably some of you are thinking about ways you would celebrate their successes and be there to support or instruct when they make mistakes. How many of you had something in each of those categories? Awesome. So I think part of the challenge is doing this in real life when all the other things are on our plates. So what I wanted to share was a quick example of how a few teachers were able to do this level of intentional implementation in their classroom practice. And Ashley and I have a session on this later, so I'm going to do it fast, and you can come get the full story from her. So we had the privilege last year of working with 3 educators. They were general education teachers. They were phenomenal educators. They were the folks we place our student teachers with and our interns with. And they invited us into their classroom to watch their practice. We were there every day from about March all the way to the week before the end of school. So we were there with them for a long time. And what we saw was amazing levels of practice. Most of their students were benefiting greatly. They were engaged most of the time we were observing before we ever did anything to help. The reason they agreed to work with us is because they each had one kiddo who was identified with a disability and had an IEP, an individualized education program, who wasn't benefiting. And so what we asked them to do is make a plan to intentionally focus on their practices for the one. Not do something super individualized, but just think about how they would enhance their prompts, their opportunities to respond, OTRs, and their specific praise to really meet the needs of the one student. So one of the teachers had this aha moment when she was thinking about her kid. Her student didn't speak verbally very often, and so that was a skill he was working on. And so it occurred to her that he wasn't actually accessing her instruction because she was requesting all verbal responses. And so it occurred to her that she could prompt communication strategies. She could actually put on her body a visual prompt for the ways he could choose to communicate while she was teaching her entire class. Before she offered the opportunity to respond, she could remind kids how they were being asked to respond or invited to respond. And then it occurred to her, he's most comfortable right now responding non-verbally, so every time I give the class a chance to participate, I can give him 2. I can initially invite him to respond how he's comfortable, and then I can ask him to start to work on vocalizing it. So she doubled what she was able to do for him, and then she followed up with specific praise, all while teaching the whole class. So this was not pulling him out and doing it separately. This was just part of her Tier 1 instruction. So some of you might be thinking, what about the other kids? Like, does that level of intentional practice harm or pull away from the supports for other kids? Well, we watched them. I mentioned we were in there until the week before school ended. They were engaged 90% of the time that we were watching, when the teacher was focused on all but also one. And for the 2 teachers that really focused on this work, their students that were identified bumped up 30% in their engagement. So their kids finally experienced what it was to access and be included in the Tier 1 instruction. They were now engaged in their learning, not by some really high, hard, complex intervention, but by just intensifying Tier 1, thinking about how we actually create that robust and differentiated universal system of support. So the big message there for all of us, regardless of age or content, is that we can do this. We can focus on the one while supporting the many. This is doable. And we can do it with really effective Tier 1 support. Some kids need more than just Tier 1, but we can start into a Tier 1 that works for everybody. So as you're thinking about how to take this back, be thinking about ways that you can help educators positively promote the social, emotional, behavioral SEB skills and academic skills to set them up for success and hopefully prevent some of the mistakes. how you can support their meaningful and relevant engagement in that activity, and how you can celebrate their successes and be there to support them when they make mistakes. So all practices we do all day, every day, but thinking about how to be more intentional to make sure the one is accessing and included in the classroom environment. So speaking of classrooms, how do we think about designing a classroom that from beginning works for all? So how do we actually do this in a way that from the beginning sets each and every student up for success? So one of my favorite resources, I'm slightly biased, is a resource that we initially developed in partnership with OSEP, and then we were able to bring it over with an updated version into the center website, is this one. It's Supporting and Responding to Students' Social, Emotional, Behavioral Needs. We don't do well with short titles. But it really does communicate what this resource is about. And so if you think about what it takes to set all students up for success, and I know you're squinting at some of those words, you have the hyperlink, it takes us being thoughtful from the beginning and collaborating with our students and families to design teaching and learning environments that are supportive and welcoming to each and every learner, to think about ways that we engage students throughout instruction in ways that are meaningful and relevant to them, that they see themselves in the curriculum, that they celebrate themselves in the curriculum. And it requires, in the third column, that we hold ourselves accountable before we ever look at who's benefiting or not. That we always start the conversation with us and how we are doing to set up an environment that is supportive, welcoming, and effective for each and every student. And then we look at who's benefiting under what conditions and how do we adjust to make it better for each and every kid. So that's a lot. And I think for some of us, we know that this is the gold standard. This is high fidelity implementation. This is effective classroom support. And for some teachers, we need a starting line. And so I would argue that the starting line is a few simple evidence-based practices that we know are easy to implement and can set each and every kid up for success. So if we started the day or the class period welcoming students into the learning environment, greeting them at the door with a brief positive interaction, saying their name and getting it right, setting them up for a success with a reminder of our shared classroom norms and values as they enter the classroom, and reminding them how to get started on their first academic assignment, we have set so many kids up for success from the moment they come in the room. If once they're there, we continue to provide reminders to set them up for success as we transition between routines, we get them actively engaged in relevant instruction, and we catch them with specific positive feedback or praise, and we are there to supportively correct them when they make mistakes, even if those mistakes are big behavioral mistakes. We supportively and instructionally correct or support students through that mistake, making sure they all experience at least a 5-to-1 ratio. So imagine if all of our classrooms looked like that. How many of you are currently classroom educators? Awesome. So thinking about your classroom, maybe that's already what it looks like. For all of you, do a mental walk around your building. How many of you can see about 80% of your classrooms in this image? About 80% of your classrooms are doing this well most of the time. I'm seeing some hands. I'm not seeing a lot of hands. So this is where we are going to continue to imagine better, right? Again, I think one of the challenges is there was some research that every minute teachers are making like 37 decisions. So while we all have intentions to do all of these things, we sometimes have a hard time doing them in the moment. So I wanted to share an example of a way we've been able to do this work, and I'm going to pause for a drink while you get to look at the cute puppy. That's Jonathan, the 15th. This Jonathan has Tier 3 behavioral needs, which is why he's now my only favorite mascot. So this work at UConn is looking at how we set teachers up for success to integrate those behavior practices, those supportive social emotional behavioral practices, into academic instruction. And the example I'm going to share is from early reading, but the message applies to any grade, any content. My school, I had kids as young as 3 and as old as 21, and this was a similar approach that we used across age ranges. The approach we were able to do in this study was, stealing a phrase from Susan Barrett, we were able to literally script the moves for teachers. So as a team, we were able to go into materials and first of all teach that good teaching is good teaching. When we look at the practices that work to support social, emotional, and behavioral skills and academic skills, they are the same practices. So when we can get teachers thinking about supporting academics and SEB skills in the same way, we already make it feel easier and more doable. And when we can literally script the moves, set them up for success in the materials, it becomes even easier. So I wanted to give a really concrete example of what that looked like, because I feel like we're talking a lot about integration over time these days. And I was on a call with a bunch of state leaders, and it was actually the leader from my state that was like, yeah, but what does that mean? And so I'm going to take a second and just show you for a second what we mean by actually integrating. So the Enhanced Core Reading Instruction Program is the one that we used. Again, it's a foundational K-2 literacy example. And this program is set up around key foundational reading routines. So those of you who have worked with some of the basic skills in early elementary probably recognize these. For some of us who have done less work in this area, I had to relearn what these things were. Each of those routines is about 1 to 3 minutes, so kids are in about 20 to 30 minutes of instruction. And each of those routines has really effective practices scripted into it. So every routine, the teachers start with an explanation, they model what it looks like, they get kids engaged in group and independent practice, and then they correct student errors to enhance learning. Hopefully some folks are noticing there's a practice maybe missing. So as we went into the curriculum, the first thing we said is, well, how about let's set kids up for success with a prompt or reminder of the social, emotional, behavioral skills they need to access that routine, and then let's praise them when they get it right. So whether they respond with the correct reading skill, or whether they are engaging in the social, emotional, behavioral skill that are consistent with their classroom norms. We also then ask the teachers to explicitly teach the shared norms or values for their classroom in the context of these materials. So kids knew exactly what it looked like to show that we are a respectful community or we are a kind community, whatever their selected expectations or norms were. So teachers started every lesson with a quick reminder. They then asked the students to collectively set a goal for how many points they were going to earn using the teacher-student game. And at the end of the lesson, they did a wrap-up to reflect on how it went, had the students determine if they met their goal or not. If they did, they got a quick 1-minute celebration. If they didn't, they had a quick conversation about how to do better the next time. You guys with me? So we went into the materials. I'm going to show you in very small detail what this actually looked like very fast. So in one of the routines, and I know you can't read the text, the scripted curriculum was already there. Every place that there is a link is where we actually inserted the behavioral content. So we literally scripted the moves for the educators. So the big idea is we can adjust materials. If we can't actually change the curriculum, we can add Post-it notes. If we use lesson plans, we can adjust the lesson plan. So we can set folks up for success by training, by teaching, by coaching what it looks like to actually implement practices. I want to show you how it worked. And these are preliminary data. This was a randomized control trial, so some of you are going to geek out and some of you are going to kind of glaze over. But the cool messages will be exciting, I hope, for everybody. So how many of you have gone back in your schools, your districts, your states to try to ask for time to teach social, emotional, behavioral skills, SEL, to work on behavior support practices, any of the synonyms? How many of you have tried having that conversation? So take 15 seconds and in your own head or quickly with the partner next to you so it's fast, What are some of the things you have heard when you have asked for time to do that? And coming back in 3, 2, and 1. So in this room, I'm not going to ask you to share out, but I am going to ask, for how many of you did you have some conversation about that it would take time away from academics? For how many of you was there a concern that it would dilute or harm academic instruction? So time seems to be the biggest kind of question or barrier. So this next graph is not our main finding, but it is the most exciting finding from my perspective. So I'm going to take a second and walk us through this one, and then the rest of them I promise I will do faster. So this is a graph of fidelity of implementation. And we set the bar really high for our tool, so you shouldn't be concerned that those percentages are lower because it's not like the TFI. If you notice, there are 2 colors. The teal color are the teachers in our integrated condition. The gray is always going to be, for all the graphs, teachers that are implementing the same reading program, so high quality reading instruction with the same amounts of training and coaching, so effectively supported, but not integrated. If you had to just guess, which bar would you say won? Teal. Right? The integrated condition won. So what I want you to pay attention to is we expected the teachers in our integrated condition to rock the behavior stuff. Like that's what we were explicitly training them to do, so we expected that that would be a difference. What we didn't expect, and what is my personal celebration, is the teachers on the reading content did better when they were implementing the behavior support practices too. So not only did it not harm instruction, it helped, which all of us would know from real life, but it's really amazing when that shows up in your research data. So not only did we see better implementation of the reading program when teachers were also implementing the PBIS practices, we went in and actually looked at teachers' individual practices. And the big takeaway from all of these data is that teachers got better at the things we wanted them to get better at. They were using more prompts and more specific praise, and they stopped relying on those general error corrections, the no stops and don'ts that we know are not super effective. We also saw that teachers perceived students' strengths in social emotional behavioral skills to be stronger at the end of a year in these curricula. The only difference was the 30 minutes of instruction. So the fact that they saw any differences between groups was amazing, and students were more engaged and less off task when they were receiving the behavior support practices in the context of reading. So that shouldn't probably surprise any of us, but it's one of the first studies that's actually randomized that and looked at it explicitly. So we're hoping to have this past year's data added to this, and it will soon come out as a citation you all can use. For right now, we're just kind of trusting that these data are going to hold, but we will have updated data for you at least by next year, if not sooner. So the big message, even though I went into the weeds, the big message is kids benefit when we do this well. When we effectively integrate practices, academic and social emotional behavioral practices, we can set each and every kid up for success in our classroom. So the opportunity for you, especially given how many hands were raised at the beginning of this conversation about classrooms, how are you going to take it back? If you're an educator, how are you going to think about going deeper with ways that you can connect with your students? If you are supporting educators, how are you going to help them prompt and set kids up for success in all of their academic routines in addition to the non-academic ones? How are we going to make sure that learning is relevant and meaningful and engaging for each and every kid? And how are we going to be there with them to celebrate their successes and support their mistakes? So how are we going to do all of that? And again, that resource will be helpful in guiding that conversation. So imagine if we did that. Imagine if we filled our classrooms with evidence-based practices, with trauma-informed practices, with practices that were made culturally relevant for the learners in front of us. And if we implemented those practices in an equitable way, imagine how we would set each and every student up for success. And for us to be able to do that as classroom educators, we have to have support. So how are we going to design our school systems to support our educators? How many of you have been hearing from your teachers, or maybe hearing from yourself if you are still in the classroom, about how hard it feels some days to come to work, right? How tired people are. I'm hearing words like burnout. We have critical shortages across the country, probably across the world actually, but critical shortages in the US. So we cannot have the earlier conversation without also talking about how we support ourselves as educators. And so this guide is also starting with the title Supporting and Responding, but it's a different guide about supporting and responding to educators' needs. And this also has a graphic that you're going to squint to see that talks about how we design a school system with the idea of educators in mind, thinking about them in the context of their classroom practice. And so those of you who know our tattoo graphic very well will notice that the pink columns are the systems, because systems in our graphic is pink, and the green columns are the data, because the data are green. And in this systems guide, it starts with the conversation about how do we center the needs of our educators? How do we take things off their plate and communicate priority? How do we talk about wellness in a way that is meaningful in the workplace? How do we think about what's on people's plates? Again, taking things off is a wellness activity. Setting people up for success is a wellness activity. So how do we have those conversations in a meaningful way in the workplace? The second column, how do we set educators up with the skills to make those practices feel like habits and become habits? So they're not having to think in the moment, prompt, engage, praise. That's just how they teach. So how do we train so efficiently and effectively that we get those practices ingrained? How do we provide ongoing coaching to set people up for success? How do we use data to guide that? And how do we celebrate successes? Every time I'm in front of educators, I ask them what their self-talk is they're driving home for the day. So I'm going to ask you all, not to say it out loud, but for how many of you do you spend your car ride celebrating your own successes from the day? I have a couple. How many of you instead, you might be going through the to-do list or what you have to do at home, like there's lots of things you're thinking about, but if you're thinking about reflecting on your practice, how many of us are maybe not doing the 5-to-1 ratio for ourselves? So part of the work is being able to set ourselves up for success and celebrate when we get there. And then the last 3 columns ask us to use data. They overlap a little bit with the prior guide, but the first green column asks us to look at ourselves as systems leaders. How does our team training and coaching actually work? Is it doing what we think it's doing to support the educators? And then it asks the same questions about holding our educators kind of accountable for fidelity, and then looking at our students' data. Just like I did for students, I want to elevate a couple of practices or systems features, because while we know everything is important, we sometimes need a starting line of where to dive in. So I'm going to suggest that we have to start by thinking about our educators, their current needs, and how to help them prioritize what they need and what they can do in the current context. We have to start with that conversation. We then help meet their needs with effective training and coaching. We use data to guide a continuous improvement process. And, in case you haven't noticed, celebrating success I think is really critical, not just because I think so, but because research actually says so. So we pulled that out as one of the core practices. It turns out that these 4 practices are not just good ideas for us as educators, but thanks to the work of Kent McIntosh and others, we actually know that these are some of the elements that set our schools up to sustain implementation of effective Tier 1 support. So when we have good and efficient teaming, when we have classroom systems that support implementation of classroom practices, when we're using data for continuous improvement, and when we're sharing and celebrating data with the whole staff, we see huge improvements and they sustain over time. So if we design school environments thinking about our educators in our classrooms, we can set everyone up for success. So imagine if we had systems and data that prioritized wellness, set our staff up for success, helped us achieve collective goals to meet each and every person's needs through continuous improvement. And I intentionally used person because we're thinking about educators first and foremost right here, but we always include our kids and our families. So imagine if we were able to do that. And for us as schools to do that, we have to have the support of our districts. How many of you are here representing districts? Awesome. So we know that district level leadership is critical. It is what allows this work to happen, to take life. It's what allows schools to do this work with sufficient support. And it turns out we have a blueprint to guide that work. This one also talks about school, but I'll get there in a second. So how many of you have seen, known, and loved this graphic for probably a good 10 to 20 years? So you've noticed there's some enhancements and changes. So rather than walking the whole thing through with you, I'm going to elevate a couple of things. 1, our leadership team at the school level, and right now we're saying district level, has to be representative and effective. We have to think about who is at the table to be able to do this work well. We have to have decision makers at the table, so administrators who can commit resources. We have to have educators who are representative of the environments that they work in. We have to have family members who represent not just the educators, but the families, students, and communities they serve. We have to have student voice, which for little kids might be a little bit different, but for older kids can actually mean they are at the table. We also have to have relevant areas of expertise that are represented across all of those partners, whether they're school-based or community-based. We have to have folks with behavioral science expertise, social-emotional behavioral expertise connected to that science. We have to have folks who have mental health expertise, academic expertise, physical and mental health, I said mental health, but physical health expertise. So that team becomes a really important driver of the work. And that team can then do the executive functions at the top and the implementation functions at the bottom. At the district level, we're especially prioritizing how we are supporting our schools, how we're investing in training, coaching, and evaluation. So those same exact features that we have been talking about at the school level play out at the district level too. And again, they're not just good ideas. They made it into our graphic and into the way of work because they work. When we have effective training systems at the district level, effective coaching systems at the district level, when we invest in ongoing conversations and communities of practice, and when we have places that are local where we can celebrate and show successes, we set our districts up for success for sure, but our districts are then able to support their schools in implementing and sustaining implementation of Tier 1. So these are the things that help us support this work continue to go forward. So imagine if we were able to do that effectively at the district level. How many of you are here representing state level work? Awesome. We had a fantastic state leaders meeting yesterday. We also had a fantastic district leaders meeting yesterday. And imagine if we set districts up for success by positively and proactively supporting districts who are experiencing the greatest need. Imagine if a state was set up to positively and proactively support each and every district, not reactively and punitively, positively and proactively. So the same blueprint talks about what that looks like and sounds like at the state level. So if you think about it at state level, there are a lot of things in common with what we just talked about at the district. For state folks in the room, you all also have the privilege of setting policy guidance. So every time I have the chance, I'm going to remind you that you help shape what all of the educators in your state are asked to do. You shape that through teacher certification, different related service provider certification, administrator certification. You can help us ensure that we actually have workforce capacity by enhancing pre-service training. And I'm making a special plug for that because you will find that in the coming years, we will start to enhance our supports for pre-service on our website. So that is one of the newer features we get to have in PBIS 6. So where I'm asking you to step up and help us, we are there to help you because we really want to have an educator workforce, and by educator I mean it broadly, that is ready to support our kids and do this work. So at the state level, the policy and the workforce capacity pieces are huge opportunities, but all of the other functions are critical as well. At the state level, we now know from research that when we do these things well, we set each and every district and school up for success to sustain implementation. When states have a leadership team that guides this work, that can both do the executive functions and the implementation functions. When states centralize their training efforts and systems. When states are thoughtful about what they are asking districts and schools to train and do. And when states hold themselves accountable for implementing their systems with fidelity, they are able to set their districts and schools, again, up for success. An implementation of Tier 1 with fidelity allows us to support each and every kid. So the big message from all of that kind of conversation is that we can do this work. We actually know what it means to implement at the state level, at the district level, at the school level, at the classroom level. We know what those levers are to help us engage in this work, sustain implementation, and effectively support our students. So imagine if we did it. Imagine if we realized the reason we're all here, right? Imagine if we were able to truly redesign education in a way that worked for each and every student, family, educator. Imagine. So I recently had a chance to have a conversation with the person who was credited with coining the phrase MTSS, Multi-Tiered System of Supports. And she provided what I thought was one of the clearest definitions for MTSS. She said that MTSS is providing education, whatever a child needed, whenever they needed it, no matter what. And she described that MTSS, PBIS, RTI, originated from a desire to break down the barriers, to break down the silos that were inhibiting us from providing the services to students based on funding, based on legislation, based on whatever. And by breaking down the silos, we would be able to meet the needs of each and every student. And we're going to extend to say family and educator. And I think we can describe MTSS in lots of complex ways, but I think one of the things we need to do as we leave this forum tomorrow is think about ways to take it back in phrases that make sense, in phrases that are easy to talk about, and her words to me were that. And so I want to talk about what that looked like for my student. So I mentioned that Dee showed up at our school in a hug, which is the most horrific euphemism I have ever heard. And so he was a student with complex and intensive needs. The reason he was in the hug was because his rates of self-injury were so high that with the best of intentions, the educators felt like that was what was needed to keep him safe. So it was not done with horrible intent. It was done because that was the way they knew to keep him safe. He was not in a wheelchair because he couldn't be mobile. He was in a wheelchair because they felt like it was the best way to keep him safe. So we had a different approach. We got to know him, not his identification label, not his syndrome, although we read about it a little bit to understand, but him as a human being. We learned, and he has a smile that lights up the room. The pictures do not do it justice. We learned what he loved. And among the things he loved was noise. And so our theory was that head hitting generated some interesting sensory experiences. And when he had access to anything, that, like, I can still hear him, obviously, to this day. He was a drummer. And so when we could help think about what it was that worked for him, how to redirect this into this, we had a kid who is now part of a classroom community, a classroom that had positively stated expectations and norms and values that were taught. He was part of our whole classroom community. He was also part of our school community. Again, he had complex needs, so he had more than Tier 1 supports. He also had individualized adaptive PE, OT, PT, special education. He had a lot of supports and services. By the time he left our building, he was walking independently with a walker. He was navigating environments with occasionally some assistance, but no need for a restraint. He could engage in even unpreferred routines like going into the bathroom with no need to stop him from hurting himself, with just a reminder of the things he loved doing and a quick redirection to drum instead of hit. So that wasn't like an overnight change, and there were certainly challenges and difficult things that came up. But we were able to see a student who we could support really effectively and literally break down the barriers that he came to us with. So when I think about Dee, and he's one of the kids that I carry with me daily, I think about what it means for us to design environments that work truly for each and every student. I was talking to a teacher literally just a couple of days ago about their classroom, and they said, well, I have a kid who's nonverbal and has some behaviors, so they're sitting at a table by themselves. And they were like, so can these practices that you're talking about, can they work for that kid? And my answer was unequivocally, yes. Like, we know how to do this. We can have kids in our environments. We can design environments that truly work for each and every student. And Dee's mom ended her communication last night with saying, thank you for thinking of him. So what I'm going to invite you to do throughout the rest of the forum is carry, not his story, because you don't know him other than what I've shared with you, carry your own student's story with you throughout the forum. Think about your one. Think about your many. Think about how you are going to design environments that work for each and every student, family, and educator. Imagine if we truly did that. If we truly designed environments that worked for everyone. And I'm going to ask you to go beyond imagining. Because if you leave this forum with just vague thoughts or hopes, we are going to have a missed opportunity. So while you are imagining and carrying your students with you, develop a concrete plan. Think about the observable, measurable action steps you are going to take back on Monday to make the classroom, school, district, states you support more effective for each and every learner. Concrete, observable, measurable steps, identify by when, by whom, have an action plan, and there are tools to do that. So as you are going through the forum, I would like you to continue to imagine how we make this work for all learners. Have a phenomenal morning. We will see you throughout the forum, and I'm going to invite Brian to come back up. Okay. I didn't know if you needed a couple minutes.
Right. Okay. That was amazing, Brandi. Thank you. You are absolutely brilliant. She's wonderful. I have the pleasure of participating in work groups that Brandi facilitates, and most of the time I think during the conversations, I'm like, her brain is amazing. And then she asked me a question, I'm like, I wasn't paying attention. It happens every time. That was really impressive. Thank you for putting that in the context of the PBIS framework. Your sessions start at 1:15, but getting out of here takes some time. So I'd like for you guys to, let's get on the road, let's get safe. Get to the rooms early so you have space there, and then take that break if you need it. Okay? Thank you all. We'll see you in the sessions.